Welcome to the American Valor World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. 27 acres of bone-white marble headstones stand in perfect military alignment at the American Cemetery in Carthage, Tunisia. No ostentatious monuments break the solemn symmetry. Just 2,841 markers standing 2 feet high, arranged in ranks as straight as gunshots. Among them, 240 stones bear the haunting inscription. Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God. The dead tell no tales, but the weathered stones whisper their own horrific truths. The winter of 1942-1943 marked America's first major confrontation with Nazi Germany's vaunted war machine in the rugged mountains of Tunisia. For the green American forces of II Corps, the lessons learned would come at a terrible price. What began as a confident advance toward victory devolved into a nightmarish ordeal that would see men broken in body and spirit amidst the pitiless terrain of North Africa. The story of the 1st Infantry Division, the fabled Big Red One, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass remains one of the most harrowing chapters of World War II. Men who had expected to be liberators found themselves prey, hunted by Rommel's Afrika Korps through mountain passes and sun-scorched valleys. What transpired over those brutal February days was not merely a military engagement, but a descent into the darkest corners of human experience. This is their story, documented in war diaries, after-action reports, and the testimonies of the survivors. No supernatural elements are needed to convey the horror. The facts alone are terrifying enough. November 8, 1942, 0300. Lieutenant John Spaulding of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, felt the landing craft pitch violently beneath him as it approached the beaches of Algeria. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, was underway, and the men of the Big Red One were at its spearhead. 10 minutes, the coxswain shouted over the roar of the engine. Spaulding looked at the faces of the men around him, illuminated intermittently by flares in the pre-dawn darkness. Some prayed, others vomited from seasickness. Most simply stared ahead with the vacant look of men trying not to contemplate their own mortality. "Remember, we're hitting the French," Spaulding reminded his platoon. "They might not fight. Be ready if they do." The intelligence briefings had been contradictory. The Vichy French forces controlling Algeria and Morocco might welcome the Americans as liberators, or they might resist on behalf of their German overlords. No one knew for certain. The landing craft ground against sand, and the ramp splashed down. "Move, move, move," Spaulding shouted, leading his men into knee-deep water. The beach loomed ahead, dark and silent. Then, without warning, machine gun fire erupted from concrete pillboxes overlooking the landing zone. Men screamed and fell. The water around Spaulding turned crimson. "Take cover," he yelled, diving behind a sand berm. "Parker, get the BAR up here." The Browning automatic rifle team scrambled forward, setting up their weapon to provide covering fire for the pinned infantrymen. More landing craft were arriving now, disgorging troops into the killing zone. "Sir," a runner slid in beside Spaulding. "Colonel says we need to take out those pillboxes or the whole landing is in jeopardy." Spaulding nodded grimly. "Tell him we're moving now. Signal the naval gunfire support." The absurd reality wasn't lost on Spaulding. Their first combat action in this war wasn't against Germans or Italians, but against French allies who were supposedly being liberated. 0830. By mid-morning, the beaches were secured, but at a cost. Hundreds of American soldiers lay dead or wounded, killed by the forces of a nominal ally. The French had fought with unexpected tenacity, inflicting a bloody baptism of fire on the inexperienced Americans. Colonel George Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, gathered his officers for a hasty conference behind a bombed-out customs house. "Gentlemen, this is just the beginning," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over gunfire. "Our intelligence says the real resistance will come from German and Italian forces moving to reinforce Tunisia. We need to secure our beachhead and prepare to move inland immediately. Captain Robert Bellinger, a company commander whose unit had suffered heavy casualties in the landing, looked skeptical. With respect, sir, if the French fought this hard, what can we expect from the Germans? Taylor's expression was grim. The difference, Captain, is that the French were fighting for pride. The Germans will be fighting for survival. December 24th, 1942, 1645. Sergeants Ward and Wilbur Osmun, brothers from New Jersey serving in the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division, crouched behind a stone wall overlooking the strategic hill known as Jebel el Amara, or Long Stop Hill, to the British. The rain that had plagued operations for weeks had finally stopped, but the ground remained a quagmire of thick, clinging mud that exhausted men and immobilized vehicles. "Merry Christmas Eve," Wilbur said sardonically, checking the ammunition in his M1 Garand rifle. "Not exactly what Mom had in mind for us, huh?" Ward managed a tired smile. "Next year we'll be home. You can count on that." Their regiment had been engaged in bitter fighting against German forces for control of the hill, which commanded the road to Tunis. The Allied drive that had begun with such optimism was stalling as it approached its objective. Reinforcements were pouring into Tunisia from Sicily, German and Italian troops, tanks, and aircraft that were quickly establishing a formidable defensive line. "Lieutenant says we go up at dusk," Ward said, nodding toward the rugged slope ahead. "One final push to take the summit. Early Christmas present for the brass." Wilbur said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. They had already made 3 attempts to take the hill. Each time they had been driven back with heavy casualties, the rocky slopes offering perfect defensive positions for the dug-in Germans. "This time we flanked them from the west," Ward continued, trying to sound confident, "while the Brits create a diversion from the south." "Sure," Wilbur nodded mechanically. "This time it'll work." 2010. The attack began in near darkness, with only faint starlight illuminating the treacherous slope. The men of the 18th Infantry moved silently, bayonets fixed, under strict orders not to fire until they reached the German positions. The element of surprise was their only advantage. Ward led his squad through a narrow ravine, using hand signals to direct his men. They were halfway to the summit when a flare burst overhead, bathing the hillside in harsh white light that turned the advancing Americans into exposed silhouettes. "Ambush!" someone shouted as German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Men fell screaming. Others dove for what little cover the barren slope offered. Ward found himself pinned behind a boulder, separated from most of his squad. "Wilbur!" he shouted, searching frantically for his brother amid the chaos. "Wilbur, report!" Through the din of gunfire and explosions, Ward heard a faint cry. Crawling forward, he found Wilbur sprawled in the open, blood darkening his uniform from multiple wounds. "Hang on," Ward urged, dragging his brother toward cover. "Medic! We need a medic here!" But as he pulled Wilbur behind the boulder, he realized with sickening clarity that no medic could help. His brother's eyes stared sightlessly at the star-filled sky, his body already growing cold, despite the fresh blood still seeping from his wounds. "No," Ward whispered. "No, no, no." All around, the attack was faltering. Men retreated down the slope, carrying their wounded when possible, leaving the dead behind. The Germans had repulsed yet another attempt to take Long Stop Hill, adding more names to the growing list of American casualties. Ward remained frozen, cradling his brother's body, until a lieutenant physically pulled him away. "We have to fall back," the officer insisted. "We'll get him later, I promise." But Ward knew such promises were empty. The dead were often left where they fell, especially in contested territory. His brother would become another anonymous sacrifice on the long road to Tunis, a road that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. January 21, 1943, 11:30. The Situation Room at Allied Force Headquarters in Algiers buzzed with activity as General Dwight D. Eisenhower conferred with his senior commanders. Maps of Tunisia covered the walls, with colored pins indicating unit positions and suspected German strongpoints. "Gentlemen, the situation is not developing as we had hoped," Eisenhower admitted, his normally genial face lined with concern. The enemy has established a formidable defensive line running from Bizerte to Gabes. Our initial thrust toward Tunis has been contained. British General Kenneth Anderson, commander of the First Army, pointed to the central sector of the front. We've identified elements of the 10th Panzer Division in this area. Fresh troops, recently arrived from Sicily. Our intelligence suggests they're planning a counteroffensive. Eisenhower turned to Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the American II Corps. "What's the status of your forces, Lloyd?" Fredendall, a compact man with a brusque manner, gestured confidently to the southern sector of the line. "We're well positioned to repel any attack, sir. The 1st Armored Division is deployed here at Spatla, with elements of the 1st Infantry Division in support. We've established defensive positions on the high ground, overlooking the likely avenues of approach." What Fredendall didn't mention was that he had never actually visited these positions personally. Unlike his British and French counterparts, who regularly toured the front lines, Fredendall commanded from a heavily fortified headquarters 70 miles behind the lines, a fact that was creating growing resentment among his frontline officers. Intelligence indicates that Rommel is moving north from Libya to join forces with von Arnim, Anderson continued. If they consolidate their forces, they could mount a significant offensive. "They won't catch us unprepared," Fredendall assured them. "My boys are ready for anything the Germans throw at us." Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. The American forces in Tunisia were still largely untested against German armor. Their equipment was often inferior, their tactics unproven, and their commanders inexperienced in the type of mobile warfare at which the Afrika Korps excelled. As the meeting concluded, British Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder pulled Eisenhower aside. "Ike, I'm concerned about Fredendall," he said quietly. "My liaison officers report that his headquarters staff is increasingly disconnected from the reality at the front. His positioning of units seems arbitrary." Eisenhower sighed. "I know, Arthur, but we can't disrupt the chain of command in the middle of operations. For now, we work with what we have." Neither man could have imagined how catastrophically their concerns would be validated in the coming weeks. January 30th, 1943, 0530. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Drake of the 168th Regimental Combat Team squinted through binoculars from his command post on Jebel Ksaira, a barren hilltop overlooking the Infantry Pass. The pre-dawn air carried a biting chill that penetrated his uniform. His men from the 34th Infantry Division, attached to the 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A, had been positioned here on explicit orders from II Corps Commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a man Drake had never met and who had never bothered to visit the front lines. "Movement at the pass, sir," his radio man whispered, pointing east. Through swirling dust, Drake saw them, dark silhouettes of German tanks emerging from the mountain gap, followed by half-tracks filled with infantry. The attack they had been warned about was finally coming. "Radio Combat Command A," Drake ordered calmly. "Tell them Kraut armor, at least 24 tanks, heading west towards Sidi Bouzid." Drake knew his position was precarious. Fredendall had ordered these defensive islands on the high ground, but they were too far apart to support each other. His men were effectively stranded on this rocky promontory, with limited anti-tank capability and no natural escape route. The radio crackled with acknowledgement, but no promises of immediate support. Looking down at the plain below, Drake watched as German armor methodically deployed into attack formation. The precision of their movement was chilling, like predators preparing for a kill. 0715. Captain Michael Reynolds of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment crouched beside his radio man as reports flooded in from forward observation posts. The Germans had launched their attack in force, with elements of both the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions striking simultaneously from different directions. "They're attempting to encircle the position," he told his company commander. "Tank columns moving north and south of Jebel Ksaira." Through field glasses, Reynolds watched as American Sherman tanks from Combat Command A moved to intercept the Germans. The distance collapsed their size, making them look like toys against the vastness of the desert. The first flashes of tank guns punctuated the morning air, followed seconds later by the dull thump of explosions. "Jesus," the radio man whispered. "Look at that." 3 American tanks were already burning, black smoke spiraling into the cloudless sky. The German 88mm guns were picking them off at ranges the American tanks couldn't match. Men scrambled from the smoking hulks, only to be cut down by machine gun fire that kicked up dust trails as it stitched across the earth. January 31, 1943, 6 o'clock. Private First Class Adam Wisniewski of the 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion peered through his gun sight at the advancing German armor. His M3G MC, essentially a 75mm gun mounted on a half-track, provided minimal protection against the heavy guns of the German tanks. "Range, 900 yards, his commander called out. "Load armor piercing." The loader slammed around into the breach. "Up. Target, Mark IV tank, 2 o'clock. Wisniewski traversed the gun slightly, centering the reticle on the hull of a German Panzer IV. His hands were slick with sweat despite the morning chill. "Fire!" The gun roared, and the half-track rocked backward from the recoil. Through the smoke, Wisniewski saw his shell strike the German tank, only to ricochet harmlessly off its angled armor. No effect. "Reload!" Before they could get off another shot, an 88mm shell from a distant German tank slammed into the ground just feet from their position, showering the crew with dirt and shrapnel. "Back up," the commander ordered. "We're too exposed here." As they maneuvered to a new firing position, Wisniewski saw more American vehicles burning across the battlefield. The realization was dawning on all of them. Their equipment was simply outclassed by the German armor. The 75mm gun lacked the penetrating power to defeat German tanks from the front, and their thinly armored half-tracks offered little protection against return fire. "This is slaughter," the loader muttered as they took up a new position behind a low ridge. "They're picking us off like it's target practice." 10:30. Major William Darby of the 1st Ranger Battalion watched in mounting horror as the situation deteriorated. His elite force had been attached to the 1st Infantry Division as a mobile reserve, but events were unfolding too rapidly for effective deployment. "The Krauts have tanks behind Drake's position now," his intelligence officer reported. "They've completely cut off Lasuda and Kasserine." Darby's face remained impassive, but his stomach churned. Over 1,500 American soldiers were now trapped on those 2 hills, surrounded on all sides by German armor and infantry. The radio transmitted their increasingly desperate calls for support, ammunition, and evacuation plans. "Can we reach them?" Darby asked. The intelligence officer shook his head. "Not without armor support, sir, and most of our tanks are already knocked out or retreating." Darby stared at the map, mentally calculating distances and forces. The brutal arithmetic of war offered no solutions. Those men were already as good as dead or captured. From a nearby field hospital, established in the ruins of a small mosque, came the cries and moans of the wounded. Ambulances arrived continuously, bringing more broken bodies from the front. Medical staff worked feverishly, their uniforms soaked with blood, making split-second triage decisions that determined who would live and who would die. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female physicians attached to the 1st Infantry Division, barely looked up as another stretcher was placed before her. "Third-degree burns, multiple shrapnel wounds," a medic reported. "Tank crew, he's been given morphine." Mitchell assessed the soldier quickly. Burns covered over 60% of his body, and shrapnel had torn through his abdomen. Even if they had been in a fully equipped hospital, his chances would have been slim. Here, in a field hospital with limited supplies and overwhelming casualties, there was little she could do. "Make him comfortable," she said quietly, placing a hand briefly on the dying man's shoulder before moving to the next stretcher. War created a special kind of horror for medical personnel. They saw not just the moment of violence, but its lingering aftermath, the slow deaths, the amputations, the infections, the psychological trauma. For Mitchell, the hardest part was writing letters to families, trying to assure them their loved ones had died quickly and painlessly when she knew the terrible truth was often very different. 1600, Colonel Drake stood amid the growing desperation on Jebel Kazira. German artillery had been pounding their position for hours. Medical supplies were running low, and the wounded lay suffering in improvised shelters carved into the rocky ground. He had requested permission to attempt a breakout while they still had ammunition and fighting strength. The answer from Combat Command A was unequivocal. "Hold position. Help is coming." Drake knew it was a lie. No help could reach them now. The plain below was controlled by German armor, and American air support was nowhere to be seen. "What are your orders, sir?" his executive officer asked, voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Drake scanned the faces of his men. Some were barely out of their teens, with sunburned cheeks and dust-caked uniforms. They had followed him up this godforsaken hill, and now they were looking to him for salvation. "We hold until nightfall," Drake said finally. "Then we break out toward the southwest, toward our lines. Small groups. Tell the men to ditch anything that makes noise. We move silent." As darkness fell, he knew many wouldn't survive the night. The Germans would be waiting, their machine guns trained on the likely escape routes. But staying meant certain death or capture for all of them. February 1st, 1943, 0230, Hauptmann, Captain, Karl Müller of the 21st Panzer Division observed the American positions through night vision binoculars. The primitive infrared technology allowed limited visibility in darkness, an advantage the Americans lacked. "They are preparing to move," he informed Oberleutnant Schneider beside him. "Small groups. They think we cannot see them." Schneider nodded. "The machine guns are positioned to cover all likely routes. Artillery is registered on the slopes. They will walk into a trap." Muller felt a momentary twinge of sympathy for the trapped Americans. They had fought bravely, holding their position despite being completely outmatched and abandoned by their own command. Many were as young as his brother back in Dusseldorf. "Remember, we need prisoners for intelligence," Muller reminded his subordinate. "The Führer has ordered that no quarter be given to commandos and saboteurs, but regular infantry are to be taken alive when possible." "Of course, Herr Hauptmann." What neither officer verbalized was the reality they had both witnessed repeatedly in this war. In the chaos and fear of night combat, soldiers rarely had the luxury of determining whether an enemy was trying to surrender or preparing to fire. Men on both sides often shot first and rationalized later. As the first small groups of Americans began moving down from their hilltop position, flares suddenly illuminated the landscape, turning night into artificial day. Machine guns opened fire, their tracer rounds creating webs of light that converged on the exposed soldiers. Some Americans made it to cover and returned fire. Others fell immediately. A few raised their hands in surrender, only to be cut down by gunners who either didn't see or chose to ignore their attempt to capitulate. "This is not combat," Muller thought grimly. "This is execution." By dawn it was over. Of the 1,500 men who had been trapped on the two hills, fewer than 300 made it back to American lines. The rest were dead or captured, their equipment abandoned, their positions overrun. The disaster at Sidi Bouzid was complete, a humiliating defeat that exposed the deep flaws in American preparation, equipment, and leadership. From the diary of Sergeant Anthony DeLuca, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, February 2nd, 1943. "The survivors came through our lines all night, walking wounded, men without weapons, guys so shell-shocked they couldn't even speak. They had this look in their eyes I've never seen before, like they'd stared into hell itself. One captain from the 168th was weeping openly, kept saying they'd left wounded men behind who begged to be shot rather than captured. Don't know if that's true or just battle hysteria, but it chilled me to the bone. The Germans are coming our way next, everyone knows it. We're digging in deeper, but after what happened to CCA, nobody's feeling too confident." From a letter home by Lieutenant Robert Westfield, 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, never mailed, found among his personal effects after his death on February 14, 1943. "Dearest Mom, if you're reading this, I likely didn't make it. I'm writing just in case. Things are bad here in ways I can't fully describe. Our equipment isn't up to the job. Our half-tracks might as well be made of cardboard for all the protection they offer against German 88s. Our 75mm guns can't penetrate their tanks except at close range, and getting close means exposing ourselves to their superior firepower. The men are brave, but bravery doesn't stop armor plate. We lost 17 vehicles yesterday alone. Command keeps sending us into situations we can't win. I'm not supposed to say these things, I know, but I need someone to understand what's happening here. If I don't come home, please know I did my best. Tell Dad I tried to make him proud. Tell Sarah I'm sorry I won't be there for the wedding. And please, don't believe what they might tell you about how I died. It's rarely quick or clean out here, despite what the telegrams say. All my love, Robert. Excerpts from the official after-action report. Combat Command A, 1st Armored Division, filed February 5, 1943. Enemy forces achieved complete tactical surprise despite intelligence warnings of imminent attack. Deployment of friendly forces on isolated high-ground positions proved untenable against concentrated armored assault. Communication breakdowns prevented coordinated response. Estimated losses: 98 tanks, 57 half-tracks, 29 artillery pieces, approximately 1,600 personnel killed, wounded, or missing. Recommend immediate review of tactical doctrine regarding deployment against armored formations. Equipment deficiencies noted in separate technical annex. February 14, 1943, 21:45. Private First Class James Hendricks of the 1st Infantry Division's 18th Regiment huddled in his foxhole, listening to the eerie stillness that had descended on the front. 3 days had passed since the disaster at Sidi Bouzid, and rumors flew through the American lines like desert flies. Hundreds dead, thousands captured, the 1st Armored Division shattered and in retreat. They say Rommel's coming, whispered the replacement beside him, a kid from Ohio who'd arrived just 2 days earlier. The Desert Fox himself. Hendricks spat into the dirt. Doesn't matter who's coming, we hold this line. But his bravado masked his own growing dread. He had seen the survivors of Combat Command A streaming back through their lines, hollow-eyed men with 1,000-yard stares, their uniforms caked with blood and dust, many without weapons. They spoke of German tanks that seemed invulnerable, of 88mm guns that could kill from invisible distances, of Stukas that screamed from the sky to pin men down, while Panzer Grenadiers methodically encircled their positions. What happened to the guys on those hills? The replacement asked. The ones who got cut off. Hendricks stared into the darkness. Some made it back, most didn't. He didn't mention the stories he'd heard, of wounded left behind as the survivors attempted breakouts, of men dying of thirst when their canteens ran dry, of others shot while trying to surrender, hands raised toward a merciless enemy. In the distance, the rumble of engines broke the silence, tank columns moving under cover of darkness. Whether they were American reinforcements or German attackers was impossible to tell. The uncertainty was its own form of psychological torture, the not knowing, the waiting, the imagining of what horrors the next day might bring. Hendricks checked his weapon for the dozenth time that hour, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. His fingers traced the crude words he had scratched into his helmet liner. Die with honor. It was a phrase that had taken on new meaning after Sidi Bouzid. Surrender was no longer an option he would consider. The stories of German treatment of prisoners, particularly those of Jewish heritage like himself, had spread through the American lines with chilling detail. Try to get some sleep, he told the replacement. I'll take first watch. But sleep was elusive in the cold desert night, with death lurking just beyond the perimeter of their vision. February 18, 1943, 14:30. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, bent over maps in his command vehicle, analyzing terrain and unit positions with the precision that had made him one of Germany's most formidable commanders. After 2 years of desert warfare, he had developed an almost mystical ability to read the land, to sense where the enemy was weakest, to strike where they least expected. The Americans are still consolidating their positions at Kasserine and Spiba, he told his assembled staff officers. Their command structure remains fragmented, their units dispersed. This is our opportunity. Oberst, Colonel Hans-Jürgen Dietrich, his operations officer, pointed to the map. Intelligence reports that elements of the American 1st Infantry Division have reinforced Spiba Pass, while Kasserine is held primarily by the 26th Infantry Regiment. Which is the weaker position? Rommel asked. Kasserine, Herr Feldmarschall. The American defenses there are hastily prepared and poorly coordinated. Rommel nodded, his decision already made. Then Kasserine will be our primary thrust point. We break through there, then drive northwest toward Thala and Lekef. If successful, we can threaten the entire southern flank of the British First Army. The plan was audacious, even by Rommel's standards. With limited fuel and ammunition, he was proposing to punch through the American lines, capture their supply dumps, and potentially unravel the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Prepare the attack orders, Rommel instructed. We move at first light tomorrow. As his staff dispersed to relay the orders, Rommel remained alone with his thoughts. He was gambling everything on this offensive. The Reich expected victory, but he knew better than most the precariousness of their position. Tunisia was a strategic cul-de-sac, surrounded on three sides by the Mediterranean and pressed from the west by growing Allied strength. Even if his offensive succeeded, it would only buy time. Moreover, his own health was failing. The years of desert warfare had taken their toll. Chronic sinus problems, digestive issues, and extreme fatigue plagued him constantly. This might well be his last opportunity to demonstrate the brilliance that had earned him the nickname Desert Fox. February 19, 1943, 6 o'clock. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel surveyed the American positions through his binoculars. The Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile-wide gap in the Atlas Mountains, was the gateway to the Allied supply bases. If he could punch through here, he could potentially unravel the entire Allied position in Tunisia. The Americans are still green, he told his staff officers. They dig shallow scrapes instead of proper foxholes. Their tanks operate without infantry support. Their commanders position units too far apart for mutual defense. His voice was clinical, devoid of contempt or bloodlust. This was simply the dispassionate assessment of a professional soldier who had been fighting and winning battles across Africa for 2 years. We attack at midday, Rommel said, closing his map case. First with artillery and air preparation, then with the Kampfgruppe through the center of the pass. Among his officers, there was absolute confidence. They had crushed the Americans at Sidi Bouzid. Kasserine would be no different. Anatomy of defeat, 11:45. The first shells fell like banshee wails upon the American positions defending Kasserine Pass. Colonel Alexander Stark of the 26th Regimental Combat Team, 1st Infantry Division, felt the earth convulse beneath him as German 105mm and 150mm artillery methodically bracketed his command post. "Get me fire support," he shouted into the radio handset, barely audible over the continuous detonations. "They're targeting our artillery positions." Through swirling dust and smoke, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Stuka dive bombers, peeling off to scream downward, their sirens wailing like tortured souls. Men flattened themselves against the earth, hands pressed futilely over their helmets, as if such a gesture could protect them from the bombs that followed. "Sir!" A blood-spattered messenger skidded into the command post. "Germans in the pass! Tanks and infantry!" Stark grabbed his binoculars. Through them, he could see the unmistakable forms of Mark IV tanks advancing in wedge formation, their long-barreled 75mm guns probing for targets. Behind them came half-tracks filled with Feldgrau-clad infantry, ready to exploit any breakthrough. "Where the hell is our air support?" someone shouted. But the skies belonged to the Luftwaffe. American P-40s had been conspicuously absent for days, grounded by weather at their distant airfields, while the Stukas operated with impunity. 14:30. War correspondent Ernie Pyle crawled into a shallow depression beside a machine gun position of the 1st Infantry Division. Shells exploded nearby, showering them with dirt and rock fragments. Despite the danger, Pyle scribbled furiously in his notebook, documenting the unfolding disaster for the American public back home. "How's it looking?" he asked the machine gunner, a sergeant with 3 days' growth of beard and haunted eyes. "How's it look?" the sergeant laughed bitterly. "We're getting our asses handed to us, that's how it looks. Krauts have tanks moving through the pass unopposed. Our armor's pulled back. Artillery's getting pounded. It's every man for himself soon, mark my words." Pyle nodded, recording the quote verbatim. He had covered enough combat to recognize the signs of imminent collapse. The uncoordinated movements of units, the lack of communication, the growing stream of walking wounded moving to the rear, all pointed to a defense on the verge of disintegration. "There goes another one," the sergeant commented as they watched an American half-track racing rearward, packed with soldiers abandoning their positions. "Command's lost control. It's a rout." Pyle knew his dispatches would be heavily censored before reaching American newspapers. The full extent of the disaster at Kasserine would be sanitized, the casualties understated, the command failures glossed over. But he was determined to record the unvarnished truth, even if it never saw print. "The men are fighting bravely," he wrote, "but courage alone cannot overcome superior tactics, equipment, and leadership." 15:30. "They're through the lines at point 167, the radio operator reported, his voice eerily calm as sweat streaked the dust on his face. "Tank destroyers are falling back." Captain Reynolds of the 16th Regiment felt his mouth go dry. The 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, their primary anti-tank defense, was retreating. Their M3 gun motor carriages, hastily converted half-tracks mounting obsolete 75mm guns, were no match for the German tanks with their superior armor and firepower. "Order Baker Company to prepare for counterattack," he began, but a thunderous explosion cut him off mid-sentence. When the ringing in his ears subsided, Reynolds realized the command post had taken a direct hit. Half the communications equipment was destroyed, and 3 of his staff lay wounded or dead. Through the shattered sandbagged wall, he could see German tanks less than 500 yards away, methodically advancing while firing on the move. "We need to fall back," his executive officer shouted. "We're being outflanked." Reynolds hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Orderly withdrawal. By squads. Tell the men to take the wounded if they can." He didn't add, "Leave the dead." That went without saying. The living came first now. 1845. Private First Class Tony Caselli found himself alone in the growing darkness, separated from his unit during the chaotic withdrawal. His rifle was gone, lost when a mortar round had thrown him into a ravine. His left arm hung useless, shrapnel embedded deep in his shoulder. Disoriented and in shock, he stumbled westward, following the general direction of retreat. The sounds of battle still raged behind him, punctuated by the distinctive crack of German MP-40 submachine guns, a sound veterans had learned to recognize and fear. Movement ahead made Caselli freeze. Silhouetted against the darkening sky were several figures, soldiers advancing directly toward his position. Friend or foe? In the failing light, it was impossible to tell. "Flash," Caselli whispered hoarsely, using that night's recognition signal. "Thunder," came the response, followed by unmistakably American voices. "You hurt, buddy?" 2 soldiers from the 26th Infantry materialized beside him, both looking as battered as he felt. "Caught some shrapnel," Caselli managed. "Lost my unit, 16th Regiment." "Christ, you're way off course," one of the soldiers said. 16th pulled back hours ago. We're the rear guard. Come on, we'll get you to an aid station, if we can find one that hasn't bugged out." As they helped him limp forward, Caselli became aware of other shapes moving through the darkness, dozens, then hundreds of retreating American soldiers, many wounded, most without their heavy equipment, all bearing the unmistakable demeanor of defeated men. "We're really running, aren't we?" Caselli asked numbly. The soldier supporting him laughed without humor. "Running? Hell, this isn't running. This is a goddamn stampede." 20:10. Night had fallen over Kasserine Pass, but there was no respite from the horror. Lieutenant Colonel William Darby led what remained of his 1st Ranger Battalion through a desperate fighting withdrawal. The pass had been overrun, and American forces were retreating in disarray toward Thala and Tebessa. "Patch them up as best you can," Darby told his medical officer, gesturing to a collection of wounded men propped against the hulk of a destroyed half-track. "We move in 10 minutes. The medic's face said everything. Some of these men wouldn't survive being moved, but staying meant certain capture or death when the German advance resumed at dawn. "Sir," a sergeant approached, voice hushed, "found some stragglers from the 16th. Say the Krauts broke through their whole sector. They're executing wounded, sir." Darby's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his stomach. "Get everyone on their feet who can walk. The rest we carry." Through the night, they moved westward, a battered column of exhausted men helping their wounded comrades across the unforgiving terrain. Behind them, they could hear the occasional burst of machine gun fire, Germans finishing off American wounded who had been left behind in the chaos of retreat, or perhaps executing prisoners they didn't want to feed or guard. The horror of modern warfare wasn't found in supernatural monsters, but in what men did to other men when unleashed from the constraints of civilization. The darkness of those Tunisian nights concealed atrocities that few survivors would ever speak of openly. February 21, 1943, 1400. Brigadier General Paul Robinette's Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division had established defensive positions southwest of Kasserine Pass. They had been reinforced by elements of the 1st Infantry Division under the command of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. "We stopped them here," Allen told his assembled officers, his weathered face set in determined lines. "No further withdrawal. This ground we hold." Unlike the previous defensive efforts, this position had been properly prepared. Infantry occupied mutually supporting positions with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery had been pre-registered on likely avenues of approach. Tanks were hull down in defensive positions, their main guns covering the approaches. "They've had it their way for too long," Allen continued. "Today Rommel learns that Americans can fight." General Allen had built a reputation as an unconventional commander who prioritized combat effectiveness over spit and polished discipline. His men adored him because they knew he valued their lives and would never waste them needlessly. He had spent days personally inspecting every aspect of their defensive position, making adjustments, ensuring that every unit could support its neighbors. "Sir," a staff officer interrupted, handing Allen a message form. "Report from forward observers. German armor, estimated 2 companies, approaching from the northeast. Infantry following." Allen nodded calmly. "Inform the artillery. No fire until my command. Let them come into the kill zone." 1525. Oberleutnant Werner Schroeder of the 10th Panzer Division scanned the terrain ahead through his commander's periscope. His Mark IV tank led a company advancing toward what intelligence had identified as the weakest point in the new American defensive line. "Advance with caution," he ordered his platoon leaders by radio. "The Americans are no longer running. They've had time to prepare positions." The landscape ahead appeared deceptively empty, rolling terrain with scattered rock outcroppings and shallow wadis, but Schroeder's instincts, honed by years of combat, sensed danger. The area was too perfect for an ambush. "Gunner, scan for anti-tank positions," he ordered. "Driver, reduce speed." Before his orders could be fully implemented, the world erupted around them. Dozens of American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, their shells bracketing the advancing German column with deadly precision. "Evasive action!" Schroeder shouted, but it was already too late. A shell struck the tank to his right, tearing off its turret in a catastrophic explosion that sent it cartwheeling through the air. Another impacted just meters from Schroeder's own vehicle, temporarily blinding him and rattling the entire 50-ton machine. As his vision cleared, Schroeder saw disaster unfolding across the battlefield. American tanks, previously invisible in hull-down positions, were opening fire from multiple directions. Infantry anti-tank teams armed with bazookas were engaging from concealed positions in the rocky terrain. "Reverse! All units reverse!" he ordered, but the radio returned only static. They had blundered into a perfectly executed trap. 1630. The German attack, when it came, lacked the overwhelming force of previous assaults. Rommel had pushed his forces too far, too fast, and his supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Ammunition was low, and fuel was a constant concern. Nevertheless, the panzers came forward with the same mechanical precision that had characterized all their previous attacks. What they encountered, however, was a different American army. The U.S. artillery opened fire first, a coordinated barrage that bracketed the advancing German columns. Unlike previous engagements, the Americans had positioned forward observers who called in accurate fire adjustments. The first German tank brewed up in a gout of flame, then a second. The Panzer Grenadiers accompanying them sought cover, only to find themselves exposed to interlocking machine gun fire from well-sighted American positions. "They're pulling back," a forward observer reported with barely concealed excitement. "The bastards are actually pulling back." General Allen permitted himself a thin smile. The tide was turning, but the cost had been catastrophic. February 22, 1943, 10 o'clock. Field Marshal Rommel toured the forward positions, his face impassive as he surveyed the battlefield through binoculars. The American defense had stiffened considerably, and his own forces were exhausted after days of continuous advance. "We've reached our culmination point," he told his staff officers. "The offensive must be terminated." His voice betrayed no emotion, but the decision pained him deeply. Victory had been within his grasp. The American supply dumps at Tebessa, the strategic airfields, perhaps even enough momentum to drive the Allies entirely from Tunisia. But the cold equations of warfare were unyielding. Without fuel, without ammunition, without air support, further advance was impossible. "Issue the orders," Rommel said. "We withdraw to our start positions." The great gamble had failed. Despite inflicting thousands of casualties and dealing the Americans a humiliating defeat, the strategic situation remained unchanged. The Afrika Korps would be forced to face Montgomery's 8th Army at the Meereth Line without the supplies they had hoped to capture. A German medical officer approached cautiously. "Herr Feldmarschall, forgive the interruption. What are your orders regarding the American wounded we have captured? The field hospitals are overwhelmed." Rommel's expression hardened. "They receive the same treatment as our own wounded, according to the Geneva Convention. I will not tolerate any violations. Is that understood?" "Jawohl, Herr Feldmarschall." But both men knew that such orders were not always followed, particularly by SS units and those who had served on the Russian front, where the rules of civilized warfare had long since been abandoned. The darkness of war corrupted even the most disciplined armies. February 25, 1943, 08:11. American troops cautiously reoccupied Kasserine Pass, advancing through ground littered with the detritus of battle. Burned-out tanks and vehicles marked the path of combat. Bodies, American and German alike, lay where they had fallen, already beginning to bloat in the North African sun. Captain Reynolds led his depleted company forward, stepping carefully through areas that might be mined. The smell was overwhelming: burned metal, cordite, diesel fuel, and the sickly sweet stench of decomposition. "Check for booby traps," he ordered as they approached abandoned German positions, "and get burial details organized. I want our boys taken care of first." The men moved mechanically, their faces blank. Many were replacements who had arrived just days before the battle. Those who had survived the entire ordeal walked with the stunned gait of sleepwalkers, their eyes hollow with the things they had witnessed. A young replacement retched suddenly, pointing toward a rock outcropping where several American bodies had been arranged in grotesque postures, evidently killed after being captured. "Get a hold of yourself, Private," Reynolds snapped, though his own stomach churned. "This is war. Remember what you see here. Remember it when we're pushing those bastards all the way back to Berlin." But even as he spoke the words, Reynolds wondered if such horrors could ever be avenged or forgotten. March 6, 1943, 14:30. Major General George S. Patton strode into the headquarters of II Corps, his polished boots and ivory-handled revolvers creating an immediate impression on the assembled staff officers. He had been sent to replace General Fredendall following the disaster at Kasserine Pass, and he was determined to transform the demoralized corps into an effective fighting force. "Gentlemen," Patton announced without preamble. "The orders and methods of your former commander are now null and void. We're going to start doing things my way. And my way means we're going to start killing Germans." His piercing gaze swept the room, lingering on each officer in turn. "I understand you've had a rough time. Well, that's over. From now on, we advance. We attack. We never retreat. If I catch anyone running, I'll shoot them myself." The statement hung in the air, its hyperbole underscored by the absolute conviction in Patton's voice. "Every officer will visit the front lines daily. Every soldier will dig a proper foxhole. Every unit will maintain proper discipline. The 1st Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division are fine outfits that have been poorly led. That changes today." For the next hour, Patton outlined his expectations in explicit, often profane terms. When he was finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that 2nd Corps was under new management. As the officers dispersed, General Omar Bradley, Patton's deputy, approached him. "They're good men, George," Bradley said quietly. "They just need proper leadership." Patton nodded brusquely. "They'll get it, and they'll learn that Americans can fight as well as any German. They just need someone to show them how." April 23, 1943, 11:15. Major General Terry Allen of the 1st Infantry Division stood on the slopes of Hill 609, surveying the battlefield through binoculars. Since Kasserine, his division had been transformed under Patton's aggressive leadership. They had fought their way forward, reclaiming lost ground, proving their mettle in engagement after engagement. Now they faced their greatest test, the assault on Hill 609, a towering peak that dominated the surrounding terrain. The Germans had fortified it extensively, turning it into a nearly impregnable fortress. "It's going to be costly," Allen told Colonel John Waters, his operations officer. "But we take that hill, we break their line." Waters nodded grimly. "The men are ready, sir. They've been waiting for this." The division had prepared meticulously for this attack. Artillery had pounded the German positions for days. Air support had disrupted enemy reinforcement efforts. Every soldier knew exactly what was expected of him. "Give the order," Allen said, "and may God help our boys." As the attack began, Allen watched his men advance up the steep slopes, moving from cover to cover, supporting each other with disciplined fire teams. They were a different army than the one that had fled in disarray at Kasserine just 2 months earlier. They were veterans now, tempered by defeat, hardened by experience, determined to prove themselves. The battle for Hill 609 would rage for 3 days. The 1st Infantry Division would suffer hundreds of casualties. But unlike at Kasserine, there would be no retreat, no rout. They would take the hill and break the German line, contributing significantly to the final Allied victory in Tunisia. The lessons of Kasserine had been learned at terrible cost, but they had not been in vain. The Battle of Kasserine Pass cost the Allies approximately 10,000 casualties, including 6,500 Americans, many from the 1st Infantry Division. Over 4,000 were taken prisoner, 2,500 were wounded, and nearly 300 tanks and 2,000 vehicles were lost. But from this disaster emerged the army that would eventually liberate Europe. The lessons learned in the blood-soaked passes of Tunisia would be applied on battlefields from Sicily to Normandy, from the Ardennes to the Rhine. Major General George S. Patton replaced Fredendall as commander of 2nd Corps, instituting strict discipline and aggressive tactics. Equipment was improved, training was intensified, and leadership at all levels was scrutinized and reformed. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, would go on to fight with distinction through Sicily, Normandy, and into the heart of Germany. Today, the American cemetery at Carthage stands as a silent testament to the men who gave their lives in Tunisia. Among the precise rows of white markers, the wind carries whispers of their sacrifice, a sacrifice that transformed a green, untested army into the fighting force that helped bring down the Third Reich. The ghosts of Kasserine still haunt those windswept passes. Not supernatural specters, but the echoes of very real men who suffered and died in one of history's most brutal crucibles. Their story serves as a stark reminder that in war, the most terrifying monsters are not the products of imagination, but human beings themselves. From the Journal of Captain Michael Reynolds, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, written May 10, 1943, after the German surrender in Tunisia. It's over, at least this part of it. We've won, but victory tastes like dust and blood. Looking back to Kasserine, it seems like a lifetime ago. We were different men then, inexperienced, overconfident, unprepared for what war truly meant. So many good men died learning those lessons. Smith, Garrity, Miller, Martinez, all gone. Sometimes I see their faces when I try to sleep. They look as they did in those final moments, confused, afraid, abandoned. The replacements who've joined us since don't understand. They weren't there. They didn't see what retreat looks like, what defeat smells like. They're eager for glory, for their chance to prove themselves. I don't have the heart to tell them what's waiting. Tomorrow we begin preparing for Sicily, another invasion, another campaign. The generals say we're ready now, that we've become a formidable fighting force. Perhaps they're right, but I wonder if any of us who survived Kasserine will ever truly be whole again. Some wounds don't heal, even when they leave no visible scars. God help us all for what lies ahead. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.